Sometimes, the smallest voice in the room can expose the biggest secret. The crystal chandeliers above the Grand Crescent Hotel scattered golden light across the ballroom, where New York's wealthiest investors, politicians, and executives gathered for the annual Hawthorne Foundation dinner. Waiters in white gloves moved silently between tables draped in ivory linen, while a string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. At the center of it all sat Richard Callaway, chairman of Callaway International Holdings, a man whose name carried enough power to move stock markets with a single sentence. At 51, Richard had perfected the art of emotional control. His silver-threaded dark hair was immaculately styled, his custom tuxedo fitted with military precision, and his expression calm in the way only powerful men could manage after decades of commanding boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations. People watched him constantly tonight. Investors waited for his approval. Reporters hoped for a quote. Socialites angled for invitations into his orbit. And seated beside him, elegant in a diamond-covered navy gown, was Victoria Mercer, the philanthropist heiress the tabloids had spent months calling his future wife. "Richard," Victoria said softly, touching his arm as cameras flashed from across the ballroom. "Everyone's waiting for your speech." Richard glanced toward the stage where the event coordinator nervously checked her clipboard for the third time in a minute. He gave a small nod, but before he could rise, movement near the ballroom entrance caught his attention. A little girl, no older than 5, slipped away from the hand of a distracted waitress carrying champagne trays. She wore a pale blue dress with tiny white flowers stitched along the hem, slightly wrinkled like she'd fallen asleep in it earlier. Her dark curls bounced as she hurried between tables, carefully avoiding adults who barely noticed her existence. Richard should have looked away. Normally, he would have. Children rarely attended these events, and strangers' children certainly weren't his concern. But something about the little girl made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Maybe it was her eyes. Large, serious, impossibly familiar brown eyes. She stopped only a few feet from his table and looked up directly at him. The room around Richard seemed to fade beneath the soft hum of music and distant conversation. The girl stared at him with innocent certainty for one long second before her entire face lit up. "Daddy," she called brightly. Every sound inside the ballroom vanished. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the violinist faltered before awkwardly continuing the melody. Richard didn't move. He couldn't. The single word hit him harder than any public scandal, harder than hostile takeovers or courtroom battles or the day his father died 23 years ago. "Daddy." Victoria blinked beside him, her smile collapsing in confusion. Across nearby tables, dozens of wealthy strangers turned toward them openly now, curiosity spreading like wildfire through the room. The little girl stepped closer, completely unaware of the silence surrounding her. "Mommy said you were busy," she continued innocently, tugging lightly on Richard's sleeve. "But I knew it was you." Richard looked down at the tiny hand gripping the fabric of his tuxedo jacket, and suddenly the air in the ballroom felt painfully thin. Because up close, there was no denying it anymore. The child had his mother's eyes. Richard's stomach twisted sharply. Caroline. After 5 years, after every unanswered question and every locked-away memory, one name crashed violently back into his mind. Then came the sound of a tray nearly crashing to the marble floor. Richard looked up. Near the edge of the ballroom stood a woman in a black server uniform, frozen beside a champagne cart, while horror drained the color from her face. Caroline Bennett. The woman he hadn't seen in half a decade stared at him like the world had just ended. Caroline Bennett had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways during the past 5 years, but never like this. Never beneath crystal chandeliers with half of Manhattan watching in silence while her daughter stood beside Richard Callaway calling him daddy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her pulse hammered painfully as she hurried across the ballroom, nearly colliding with a waiter carrying champagne flutes. "Emily," she said breathlessly when she finally reached the table, forcing a strained smile onto her face while every eye in the room burned into her skin. "Sweetheart, what did Mommy tell you about bothering guests?" The little girl looked confused rather than guilty. "But Mommy," she whispered softly, "that is him." Caroline's stomach dropped. Richard still had not moved. His expression remained dangerously unreadable. But Caroline knew him too well not to notice the slight tightening in his jaw or the rigid stillness in his shoulders. Those were always the signs that emotions were breaking through the control he guarded so carefully. Victoria Mercer recovered first. She straightened elegantly in her chair and glanced between Caroline and the child with cold confusion. "Richard," she said quietly, though everyone nearby could still hear her. "What exactly is going on?" Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed entirely on Emily. The little girl shifted closer to Caroline, but kept peeking curiously at him. "Mommy," she whispered again. "Why is he looking at me like that?" Caroline crouched quickly beside her daughter, smoothing trembling fingers over the child's curls. "Because you surprised him, baby," she murmured gently. "Now let us apologize and go home, okay?" "But he looks sad," Emily replied with heartbreaking sincerity. Around them, whispers spread across nearby tables like sparks catching dry grass. People recognized Caroline now. Some remembered the scandal years ago when Richard's mysterious engagement abruptly ended weeks before the wedding. Others simply saw the resemblance between the chairman and the child standing beside him. The resemblance was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily had Richard's eyes, his dark hair, even the same small crease between her brows whenever she looked confused. Richard finally stood. The movement alone shifted the entire atmosphere in the ballroom. Conversations instantly died again. At 6'3", Richard carried authority effortlessly, and now every inch of his controlled posture radiated tension. "Caroline," he said, quietly. Her name sounded unfamiliar coming from him after so many years. Caroline forced herself to meet his gaze. "Richard." Victoria rose beside him slowly, confusion sharpening into suspicion. "You know her?" she asked. Richard still did not look away from Caroline. "We were engaged." The words landed heavily over the ballroom. Caroline saw the realization ripple through the surrounding guests. Some exchanged startled glances while others openly stared now, no longer pretending discretion. Emily looked up brightly. "Mommy, engaged means almost married, right?" Caroline swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart." Emily's eyes widened with innocent excitement before she looked back at Richard again. "Then I was right." Richard's breath caught so faintly most people would not have noticed it. Caroline did. She noticed everything about him still, and that terrified her more than the public humiliation unfolding around them. "Emily," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice calm. "We are leaving now." But Emily frowned. "I do not want to leave yet." Her small hand slipped free from Caroline's grip before the exhausted single mother could stop her. The little girl stepped directly toward Richard and tilted her head up at him with complete trust. "Mommy cries when she sees your picture," she said softly. The ballroom went dead silent again. Caroline felt all the air leave her lungs. "Emily," she whispered sharply. But the child continued innocently, unaware of the devastation her honesty caused. "She thinks I do not know, but I hear her sometimes." Richard stared down at the little girl like the ground beneath him had cracked open. Victoria slowly turned toward him, her face pale now. "Richard," she said again, barely above a whisper this time. "Who is this child?" And for the first time in years, the chairman of Callaway International looked like a man who no longer trusted himself to speak. The silence surrounding Richard Callaway lasted only a few seconds, but to Caroline it felt endless. Every instinct inside her screamed to grab Emily and run before the whispers turned into headlines by morning. She had spent 5 years protecting her daughter from this exact moment, building a quiet life held together with overtime shifts, unpaid bills, and careful lies told gently enough that Emily never noticed the cracks underneath them. And now everything was unraveling beneath the bright lights of a ballroom filled with strangers. Richard finally lowered his eyes toward Emily again. The little girl looked up at him fearlessly, completely unaware that some of the most powerful people in Manhattan were staring at her as if she had just detonated a bomb in the center of the room. "What is your name?" Richard asked softly. His voice had changed. Caroline heard it instantly. The cold authority was gone, replaced by something raw and dangerously human. "Emily Bennett," the little girl answered proudly. Then she smiled. "I am 5.5. Mommy says the half matters." A few nervous laughs escaped nearby tables, but Richard did not react. His gaze sharpened slightly at the last name. "Bennett." Caroline saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. 5.5 years old. 5 years since she disappeared from his life without explanation 3 weeks before their wedding. 5 years since he tore apart half of New York trying to find her before eventually convincing himself she had simply stopped loving him. Victoria folded her arms tightly beside him. "Richard," she said carefully, "please tell me this is not what it looks like." He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Caroline for the first time since she approached the table. "You disappeared," he said quietly. The accusation beneath the words cut deeper than Caroline expected. "You changed your number. You left your apartment. No one knew where you went." Caroline felt heat rush into her face as dozens of people continued pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. "This is not the place," she whispered. "No," Richard replied, his eyes drifting briefly back toward Emily. "I do not think it is." Emily looked between them in confusion. "Did you used to know each other before me?" The innocent question nearly shattered what little composure Caroline had left. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could answer, one of the board members approached cautiously from a nearby table. "Mr. Calloway," the older man said awkwardly, "the press representatives are beginning to notice the situation." Of course they were. Caroline turned slightly and immediately spotted several guests discreetly raising phones beneath the tables. Her stomach twisted violently. Tomorrow morning her daughter's face could be splashed across every gossip site in America. "Emily," she said quickly, forcing calm into her voice, "go wait by the lobby entrance for Mommy, okay?" The little girl hesitated. "But, please, sweetheart." Emily glanced once more at Richard before nodding obediently. As she turned away, she accidentally bumped the corner of the table, knocking a glass sideways. Richard reacted instantly, catching it before it shattered against the floor. Emily looked up at him with wide eyes. "Wow," she whispered. "Mommy does that too." Richard froze again. Caroline closed her eyes briefly, because he knew exactly what Emily meant. 5 years ago, Caroline had always caught falling objects before they hit the ground. Richard used to tease her about her impossible reflexes during late nights cooking together in his penthouse kitchen. Tiny things, tiny habits, the kind genetics sometimes copied without permission. Emily hurried toward the ballroom entrance, disappearing into the crowd of wealthy strangers. Richard watched her until she was safely out of sight. Then his attention returned slowly to Caroline. "How old is she exactly?" he asked quietly. Caroline swallowed hard. Around them, the tension had become unbearable. Victoria looked seconds away from walking out while nearby executives openly exchanged stunned glances. Even the musicians seemed distracted now, their soft melody uneven beneath the weight of the unfolding scandal. Caroline should have lied. She should have protected herself the way she had for years. But looking into Richard's eyes again after all this time made lying suddenly impossible. 5 years, she answered softly. Richard's expression darkened with realization. 5 years, he repeated slowly. Then his voice dropped lower. "Caroline, when you left me, were you already pregnant?" Caroline could feel every pair of eyes in the ballroom waiting for her answer. The chandeliers above suddenly seemed too bright, the music too distant, the silence too heavy. Richard's question hung between them like something alive and dangerous. "Were you already pregnant?" 5 years ago, she would have answered him immediately. Back then there had never been secrets between them. Richard had known every dream she carried, every fear she tried to hide behind stubborn smiles, every tiny habit she thought nobody noticed. He had known her better than anyone in the world. That was what made this hurt so much. Caroline glanced toward the ballroom entrance where Emily waited patiently beside a marble column, swinging her little legs while watching guests pass by in glittering gowns and tuxedos. Completely innocent, completely unaware that her entire life had just shifted beneath her feet. "Richard," Caroline whispered carefully, "please." But he stepped closer instead. Not aggressively, not angrily, just close enough that she could see the storm building behind the control in his gray eyes. "Answer me." Victoria let out a quiet breath beside them. "I think I deserve an explanation too." Caroline looked at her then. Beautiful, elegant, composed. The kind of woman newspapers described as perfect beside a man like Richard Calloway. Caroline suddenly became painfully aware of her own black server uniform and sensible shoes bought on clearance nearly a year ago. She had spent the evening refilling champagne glasses while Victoria arrived through the front entrance beside cameras and flashing lights. Their worlds could not have been more different anymore. I found out after I left, Caroline said finally. Richard stared at her. How long after? 3 weeks. The color drained slowly from Victoria's face. Richard did not blink, did not move. For one terrible moment, Caroline wondered if he had stopped breathing altogether. Then he looked away sharply, one hand bracing against the edge of the table as though steadying himself. 5 years ago, 3 weeks after Caroline vanished from his life, Richard had destroyed half his penthouse apartment in frustration, trying to understand why she disappeared without explanation. He had searched airports, called hospitals, hired private investigators, even contacted old college friends she had not spoken to in years. Nothing. She had vanished completely. And all that time, she had been carrying his child. Why? He asked quietly. Caroline felt tears burn behind her eyes instantly, because she knew exactly what he meant. Not why did you leave? Why did you never tell me? Her throat tightened painfully. Because your mother offered me a check to disappear before the wedding. Richard looked up sharply. Victoria frowned in confusion. Nearby conversations stopped again as several people openly leaned closer. Caroline hated this. Hated that the worst moment of her life was unfolding like public entertainment beneath crystal chandeliers. But after years of silence, the truth was finally escaping whether she wanted it to or not. She told me I would ruin your future, Caroline continued softly. That your board members already questioned the engagement because I came from nothing. She said if I truly loved you, I would leave before I destroyed everything you worked for. Richard's expression hardened instantly. My mother did what? Caroline gave a weak laugh, filled with exhaustion instead of humor. She was very convincing. Richard shook his head once, disbelief flashing across his face. No. If you had told me, I was 24 years old and terrified, Caroline interrupted quietly. Then I found out I was pregnant after I already left. Richard fell silent again. Across the ballroom, Emily suddenly sneezed twice in a row and rubbed her nose sleepily. Caroline instinctively reached into her apron pocket for the small bottle of children's allergy medicine she carried everywhere. Richard noticed immediately. Seasonal allergies? He asked automatically. Caroline froze. Because Richard suffered from the exact same allergy every spring and fall. Severe enough that he always kept medication nearby. Emily inherited it too. Before Caroline could answer, Emily wandered back toward them, rubbing her eyes. Mommy, she mumbled tiredly. My chest feels funny again. Caroline's expression changed instantly. Richard saw it. What does that mean? He asked sharply. Caroline knelt beside her daughter, pressing gentle fingers against the little girl's back while trying to stay calm. Did you run too much, sweetheart? Emily nodded weakly. And the flowers smell strong in here. Richard's stomach tightened painfully as Caroline pulled a small inhaler from her apron pocket. His eyes locked onto it instantly, because he had carried the exact same kind in his briefcase for most of his adult life. Richard stared at the inhaler in Caroline's hand as though it had shattered the last illusion still protecting him from the truth. The small blue device looked painfully familiar because he had owned versions of it since childhood. Severe allergies. Seasonal asthma attacks triggered by strong perfume, flowers, dust, and cold air. Doctors once warned him as a teenager that stress made the symptoms worse. His father used to carry spare inhalers in every car. And now Caroline was kneeling in the middle of a ballroom, helping a little girl with the same condition breathe steadily again. Emily took 2 careful breaths from the inhaler before leaning sleepily against her mother's shoulder. Better? Caroline asked softly. Emily nodded. The flowers just smell too strong. Richard glanced around the ballroom. Hundreds of white roses decorated the tables tonight because Victoria specifically requested them for the gala. His chest tightened painfully. 5 years. 5 entire years. Caroline rose slowly with Emily in her arms. The little girl rested her head against her mother's shoulder, exhausted from the excitement and confusion surrounding her. I need to take her home, Caroline whispered. Richard immediately stepped forward. Where do you live? Caroline's expression hardened at once. No, Caroline, you do not get to walk back into our lives tonight and suddenly act like a father. The words hit him harder than she intended. She saw it immediately in his face. Richard looked down briefly, absorbing the damage in silence. Around them, guests continued pretending not to stare while failing miserably. Victoria remained motionless beside the table, pale and distant now, as if the Entire evening no longer felt real. How long has she had asthma? Richard asked quietly. Caroline hesitated. Since she was 3. Has she been hospitalized? Twice. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Caroline hated herself for the guilt that flashed across his face, because some cruel part of her still remembered how deeply he used to care about people he loved. He would have sat beside hospital beds for days if he had known. He would have learned every medication schedule and every emergency contact number. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. Mommy, Emily mumbled sleepily. Can we go now? Caroline kissed the top of her daughter's curls. Yes, sweetheart. But before she could turn away, Victoria finally spoke. Did you know? She asked Richard quietly. He looked at her slowly. No. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Caroline suddenly felt like an intruder standing inside the ruins of someone else's life too. All these years, Victoria whispered. You thought she just left? Richard nodded once. Victoria laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Only heartbreak. And now you have a daughter. Richard did not answer because there was nothing left to deny anymore. Emily looked too much like him. The timing matched. The asthma. The eyes. Even the stubborn tilt of her chin whenever she became confused reminded him painfully of himself. Victoria swallowed hard before straightening her shoulders with practiced elegance. I think I should leave. Victoria, do not, she interrupted gently. Not tonight. She reached for her clutch purse from the table, then paused beside Caroline unexpectedly. For a brief second, the two women looked at each other quietly. One wearing diamonds beneath ballroom lights, the other carrying exhaustion behind tired eyes and an old server uniform. You raised her alone? Victoria asked softly. Caroline nodded once. Victoria looked toward Emily sleeping against her shoulder. She seems loved. Caroline felt emotion tighten painfully in her chest. More than anything, Victoria gave a small, sad smile before walking away through the ballroom without another word. Cameras instantly followed her exit. Richard barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed down to the little girl resting against Caroline's shoulder. Caroline, he said carefully after a long silence, please let me drive you home. No, it is almost midnight. You both came here on the subway, did not you? Caroline froze. Richard noticed immediately. Your shoes are wet from the station stairs outside, he explained quietly. And Emily fell asleep twice standing up tonight. She is exhausted. Caroline hated that he still noticed everything. We are fine. Richard looked at her for several seconds before reaching into his pocket for a business card. Instead of handing it to her directly, he slipped it carefully into the small pocket of Emily's cardigan. That is my private number, he said softly. 24 hours a day. If she cannot breathe. If you need help. If anything happens. Caroline stared at him silently. I know you do not trust me right now, Richard continued quietly. But please do not punish her for what happened between us. Before Caroline could answer, Emily suddenly stirred against her shoulder and whispered something half asleep that made Richard's entire expression break apart completely. Good night, Daddy. The drive home felt longer than usual, mostly because Caroline could not stop replaying the look on Richard's face when Emily called him Daddy again before falling asleep. Even now, nearly 40 minutes later, her hands still trembled slightly against the steering wheel of her aging Honda Civic. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as Manhattan's glowing skyline disappeared behind her in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Emily slept curled beneath a faded pink blanket with one tiny hand wrapped around the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. Caroline glanced at her daughter repeatedly during red lights, making sure her breathing stayed steady. Asthma attacks always exhausted her afterward. The old apartment building in Queens looked even more worn out after midnight. Flickering hallway lights buzzed overhead as Caroline carried Emily upstairs to their third-floor unit, careful not to wake her. Apartment 3B was small enough that the kitchen practically blended into the living room, but it was clean and warm and filled with tiny traces of Emily everywhere. Crayons on the coffee table, children's books stacked beside the couch, a pair of glitter sneakers kicked beside the heater. Caroline laid Emily gently into bed and tucked the blanket beneath her chin. The little girl stirred sleepily. Mommy, I am right here, sweetheart. Emily blinked up at her through heavy eyes. Was he really my daddy? Caroline's chest tightened painfully. She sat carefully on the edge of the bed, brushing curls away from Emily's forehead. 5 years. 5 years she had prepared herself for this question, yet somehow she still had no idea how to answer it. Yes, she whispered finally. Emily looked thoughtful instead of shocked. I knew it. Caroline almost laughed through the tears threatening her eyes. How? Emily shrugged sleepily. Because when I drew pictures of him, he always looked right in my head. Caroline stared at her daughter in silence. Children understood things adults complicated. To Emily, tonight had not been scandal or heartbreak or unfinished history exploding beneath ballroom lights. She had simply recognized her father. Are you mad at me? Emily asked quietly. Caroline blinked quickly. For what? For saying daddy out loud. The question shattered her. Caroline leaned down immediately and kissed her daughter's forehead. Never, she whispered fiercely. Never for that. Emily relaxed instantly beneath the blankets. He looked lonely, she murmured drowsily. I did not want him to feel lonely anymore. Within seconds, she drifted back to sleep, leaving Caroline sitting frozen beside the bed with tears silently slipping down her face. Across Manhattan, Richard Calloway stood alone inside his penthouse office, staring out at the rain-soaked skyline without truly seeing it. The gala ended nearly an hour ago, but he remembered almost none of it. Investors spoke to him. Board members asked questions. Reporters requested statements. He answered none of them, because every thought inside his mind returned to one small girl with brown eyes and an inhaler tucked into her cardigan pocket beside his business card. 5 years old. Asthma. Seasonal allergies. Caroline's smile. His eyes. His daughter. The words still felt impossible. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. Come in, Richard said distractedly. His longtime assistant Martin stepped carefully into the office holding a tablet. Sir, he began cautiously. Social media is beginning to circulate photographs from tonight. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Of course it was already happening. How bad? Martin hesitated. Several guests recorded the interaction. Most outlets are speculating the child may be yours. Richard laughed softly once without humor. Speculating. Martin studied him carefully. He had worked beside Richard for nearly 18 years and had never once seen the chairman look shaken before tonight. Would you like the legal team to intervene? Richard turned slowly from the windows. No, Martin blinked in surprise. Sir, no statements, no threats, no damage control. Because for the first time in years, Richard realized he did not care about headlines. Not compared to the unbearable realization that his daughter learned to walk, speak, laugh, and suffer through asthma attacks without him there even once. Find out everything you can about Caroline Bennett, Richard said quietly. Martin nodded immediately before pausing. Professionally or personally? Richard's expression changed then. Softer, more human than Martin had seen in years. Personally, he answered. I want to know how they have been living. Nearly an hour later, while rain continued falling against the windows, Martin returned holding a thin file with an expression Richard did not like at all. Sir, he said carefully, I think you should see this immediately. Richard took the file from Martin slowly, though something deep inside him already sensed he was not prepared for whatever waited inside. The folder itself was thin, too thin for 5 years of someone's life. He opened it carefully and immediately saw the first photograph clipped to the front page. Caroline stood outside a grocery store in Queens wearing a winter coat that looked too light for the weather, while Emily sat in the shopping cart, holding a box of cereal almost bigger than her. Torso. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken 8 months ago. Richard stared at the picture far longer than he should have. Caroline looked exhausted. Not the kind of tiredness sleep fixed. The kind that settled into someone after years of carrying everything alone. She works part-time for the hotel catering company, Martin explained quietly. Before that, she worked at a bookstore in Brooklyn until it closed last year. Richard flipped to the next page. Medical bills, prescription receipts, late rent notices, a hospital discharge summary from 2 years earlier after Emily suffered a severe asthma episode during winter. Richard's chest tightened so painfully he almost stopped breathing himself. Why was this not caught sooner? He asked hoarsely. Martin looked confused. Sir, 5 years. Richard's voice sharpened with self-directed anger. How did nobody tell me Caroline Bennett vanished off the face of the earth carrying my child? Martin hesitated carefully. Sir, with respect, no one knew there was a child. Richard closed the file briefly and pressed both hands against his desk. He remembered the months after Caroline disappeared. The rage. The confusion. The sleepless nights. His mother insisting Caroline had simply become overwhelmed by the pressure of marrying into his world. His board encouraging him to move forward quietly to avoid damaging the company image before the merger. Everyone treated it like an embarrassing breakup, but none of them had known she was pregnant. Or maybe someone had. Richard's expression darkened instantly at the thought. "Martin," he said quietly, "did my mother know where Caroline went?" Martin looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "I cannot say for certain." That was answer enough. Across Queens, Caroline sat at her tiny kitchen table long after midnight, staring at Richard's business card beneath the weak yellow glow of the overhead light. Emily's inhaler rested beside it. Outside, rain continued falling steadily against the apartment windows while old pipes rattled softly inside the walls. Caroline should have thrown the card away hours ago. Instead, she kept staring at the number printed beneath Richard's name. Private line. 24 hours a day. She hated how much comfort that offered her. The sound of coughing suddenly echoed from Emily's bedroom. Caroline stood immediately and hurried down the short hallway. Emily sat upright in bed, rubbing her chest sleepily. "Sweetheart," Caroline asked softly. "I cannot breathe good again." Panic flashed instantly through Caroline despite years of practice hiding it. She grabbed the inhaler from the nightstand and helped Emily sit forward carefully. "Slow breaths for mommy, okay?" Emily tried, but the wheezing sound in her tiny lungs grew worse instead of better. Caroline's stomach dropped. "No, no, no," she whispered shakily. Another sharp cough bent Emily forward. Caroline checked the inhaler with growing horror. Empty. Completely empty. She thought there was enough medication left for at least another day. "Mommy," Emily whispered fearfully. Caroline forced calm into her voice while grabbing her coat. "We are okay, sweetheart. We are just going to urgent care." But her hands trembled badly as she reached for her purse because she already knew exactly how much money sat in her checking account tonight. $83.14 until payday next week. Another cough shook Emily's chest. Caroline froze for one terrible second before her eyes drifted helplessly toward the business card still sitting on the kitchen table. Richard's private number. 24 hours a day. Caroline closed her eyes tightly. Pride or her daughter? 5 years of surviving alone or one impossible phone call? Emily coughed again, weaker this time. Caroline grabbed the card instantly and dialed before she could lose the courage to do it. The phone rang only once. "Caroline." Richard answered immediately, fully awake as if he had been waiting beside the phone all night. The sound of his voice nearly broke her apart completely. "Richard," she whispered shakily while holding Emily close against her chest. "I would not call unless I had no other choice." Richard was already grabbing his car keys before Caroline finished explaining. The fear in her voice erased every remaining barrier between past and present. "How bad is her breathing?" he asked sharply while striding through his penthouse toward the elevator. "She is wheezing and the inhaler is empty," Caroline admitted quietly. Another cough sounded through the phone, small and painful. Richard's chest tightened instantly. "Do not wait for urgent care," he said firmly. "I am coming to get both of you." "Richard, you do not have to, Caroline." His voice softened suddenly. "Please let me do this." Silence lingered for one long second before she whispered, "Apartment 3B." 22 minutes later, headlights swept across the rain-soaked street outside Caroline's building. Richard stepped out of the black SUV wearing dark slacks and a charcoal coat thrown hastily over his dress shirt from earlier that evening. He looked nothing like the polished chairman from the gala now. His hair was damp from rain, his collar slightly crooked, and raw worry visible across his face. Caroline opened the apartment door before he could knock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 5 years ago, Richard practically lived inside this expression on her face whenever she was frightened, but trying not to show it. Emily sat curled against Caroline's chest beneath a blanket, breathing unevenly. The second Richard saw her condition, every other thought vanished. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently while kneeling beside the couch. Emily looked up sleepily. "You came." The simple trust in her voice nearly destroyed him. "Of course I came." Another cough shook her tiny body. Richard stood immediately. "We are not waiting. I know a pediatric specialist at St. Vincent's." Caroline grabbed her purse quickly, embarrassment creeping into her voice despite the situation. "Richard, I cannot afford a private hospital." Richard turned toward her so fast she fell silent instantly. Do not ever think about money when she cannot breathe, he said quietly. Not angry, not cold, just absolute. 10 minutes later, Caroline sat beside Emily in the back seat, while Richard drove through rain-covered Manhattan streets faster than he probably should have. Emily rested weakly against Caroline's shoulder, clutching her stuffed rabbit, while city lights blurred outside the windows. "Mommy," she whispered. "I am here, sweetheart. Is Daddy mad at me?" Richard's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Caroline swallowed hard. "No, baby." Emily looked toward the front seat sleepily. "You are not." Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His expression softened so completely Caroline barely recognized him. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I do not think I could ever be mad at you." Emily smiled faintly before drifting half asleep again. Caroline looked away quickly toward the rain-streaked windows because something inside her chest hurt too much to watch. St. Vincent's Pediatric Emergency Wing admitted Emily immediately the moment Richard Calloway walked through the doors carrying her himself. Nurses recognized him instantly, but Richard barely noticed as doctors moved Emily onto a hospital bed for breathing treatments. Caroline stood beside the wall, twisting her hands together helplessly while respiratory machines hummed softly around the room. Richard remained near Emily the entire time, answering questions, calling specialists, memorizing medication names after hearing them once. Caroline watched him quietly in disbelief because he moved through the emergency room like someone who had done this before. "You remember all of this?" she asked softly after the doctor stepped away briefly. Richard did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Emily beneath the blankets. "My attacks were worse than hers when I was little." Caroline forgot that. Or maybe she forced herself to forget, because remembering hurt too much after he disappeared from her life. "I used to sleep sitting upright some nights," Richard continued quietly. "My father stayed awake with me during the bad ones." Caroline stared at him silently. Emily stirred slightly as the breathing treatment began helping her lungs relax. "Daddy," she whispered weakly. Richard leaned forward instantly. "I am right here." Emily blinked at him through sleepy eyes. "Will you still be here when I wake up?" The question landed softly but shattered something inside both adults standing beside her hospital bed. Richard gently brushed damp curls away from her forehead. "Yes," he answered, without hesitation. "I promise." Emily relaxed immediately and drifted back asleep. Caroline looked down quickly because tears suddenly blurred her vision again. Across the room, the pediatric doctor reviewed Emily's chart before glancing toward Richard thoughtfully. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "does anyone else in your family have the same respiratory condition?" Richard slowly looked up from his daughter's bedside. Then for the very first time since this nightmare began, he answered without uncertainty at all. "She is my daughter," he said quietly. The room fell quiet after Richard's words. "She is my daughter." Caroline looked at him sharply because this was the first time he had said it aloud without hesitation, without confusion, without fear. Not a question anymore. Not a possibility. A fact. The pediatric doctor nodded gently while making notes on Emily's chart. "That family history helps explain the asthma severity," she said. "We will monitor her oxygen levels overnight, but I think she responded well to treatment." Caroline released a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding. Richard remained beside Emily's bed, watching the tiny rise and fall of her breathing with an intensity that made Caroline's chest ache. At nearly 2 in the morning, the pediatric floor had grown quiet except for distant rolling carts and occasional soft voices from nurses' stations. Emily slept peacefully beneath warm blankets with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. For the first time all night, the panic had faded from her small face. Richard sat beside the bed while Caroline stood near the window staring out at the glowing city lights below. Neither of them knew how to speak normally anymore. Too much had happened too quickly. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "How many times has she been here?" Caroline looked down. 3. His jaw tightened instantly. "And you handled all of it alone?" Caroline gave a tired laugh. There was not exactly another option. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Guilt sat heavily across every line of his face now. "You should have told me." Caroline turned toward him sharply. "And said what exactly?" "Hello, Richard. Remember me? By the way, your mother paid me to disappear, and now I am pregnant." "I would have believed you." "Would you?" she whispered. "Because your entire world spent months convincing you I left for money or attention, or because I could not handle your life?" Richard stood slowly from the chair. I searched for you. Caroline's expression cracked slightly because she knew he was telling the truth. She remembered changing apartments twice in the first year after Emily was born because private investigators kept getting too close. I know, she admitted quietly. Richard stared at her. You knew? Caroline nodded once. The day after Emily was born, I saw one of your investigators outside the hospital. Richard looked stunned. Then why did you run? Tears filled Caroline's eyes instantly. Because I was terrified. The honesty in her voice silenced everything else. I had a newborn baby, no savings left, and your mother telling me that your board would destroy me if I came back into your life. Richard's expression darkened immediately at the mention of his mother again. She had no right. She was protecting you. Caroline interrupted softly. And maybe she was right. Richard looked at her like she had physically hurt him. Do not say that. Caroline crossed her arms tightly, trying to hold herself together. Look at your world, Richard. Billion-dollar companies. Charity galas. Cameras following your every move. Then look at mine. Richard glanced around the hospital room. Worn sneakers beside Caroline's chair. The old sweater she threw on in panic before leaving the apartment. The exhaustion carved into her face after years of surviving paycheck to paycheck. None of it made him think less of her. If anything, it made his chest hurt more. You think I care about any of that right now? He asked quietly. Caroline laughed bitterly through tears. Maybe not tonight, but eventually. Richard stepped closer before she could retreat emotionally again. Caroline, I missed 5 years with my daughter. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Do you honestly believe I care about appearances anymore? Before Caroline could answer, a small, sleepy voice interrupted. Them. Mommy. Both turned instantly. Emily had woken up and was blinking drowsily around the hospital room. Richard moved toward her bed automatically before even realizing it himself. Hey there, he said gently. Emily smiled weakly. You stayed. The simple happiness in her voice made something inside Richard break all over again. I promised I would. Emily studied him for a second before asking the question both adults feared most. If you are really my daddy, why were you gone so long? Silence crashed heavily across the room. Caroline felt panic rise instantly because no answer could protect Emily completely from the truth. But before she could speak, Richard slowly sat beside the bed and looked directly into his daughter's eyes. Because I did not know you existed, he said softly. Emily frowned in confusion. Mommy did not tell you. Richard glanced briefly toward Caroline before looking back at the little girl. No, sweetheart. Emily thought about that quietly for several seconds with the serious expression she inherited from him. Then she reached out one tiny hand and touched his sleeve gently. That is sad, she whispered. Richard swallowed hard against the emotion rising painfully in his throat. But Emily smiled softly afterward in the forgiving way only children could manage. It is okay, she said sleepily. You know now.